They laughed at his bare feet. They laughed at his matted hair. They even laughed when he stumbled walking to the defendant's chair. But when Judge Williams spoke 2 words, Medal of Honor, the laughter turned to something no one in that room would ever forget. Robert Morrison's story didn't begin in that Chicago courtroom. It actually started 15 years earlier, in the dusty mountains of Afghanistan, under enemy fire. But that day, everyone only saw the man before them, with his torn clothes, dirty beard, and holes in his shoes. When he entered the courtroom, the sound of his chains echoed against the marble floor. With each step, metal struck metal, as if summoning the ghost of an old soul. The pieces of an old military uniform visible beneath his torn jacket were now unrecognizable. Faded badges, broken buttons, the ghost of things that once meant something. The courtroom felt sterile, almost hostile. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made his hollow cheeks look even deeper. The air smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. People in pressed suits avoided eye contact, shuffling papers louder than necessary. "He's completely finished," someone whispered from the back. "Too weak to even be a threat." Another person snickered. "Maybe he's mentally ill." These homeless people always are. Robert Morrison, 52 years old, no fixed address, arrested for disturbing the peace. His crime was being reported for sleeping on a bench in Lincoln Park. When police arrived, he hadn't resisted. He'd simply stood up quietly and extended his wrists for the handcuffs. The prosecutor impatiently adjusted his tie while shuffling papers, acting as if he had more important places to be. The public defender hadn't even arrived yet. To everyone in that room, this was just another routine case, another homeless person disrupting order. Nothing that required special attention. But Judge Sarah Williams wasn't like everyone else. Seated at the front of the room, she read through the file with eyes trained by routine. She flipped pages without hurry until something made her stop. Her gaze froze on the defendant's full name, Robert James "Tank" Morrison. Her body went rigid. An old memory she kept locked away, like a scar, suddenly surfaced with crushing force. This name sounded familiar to her, very familiar. She remembered those letters from 15 years ago, the ones her son Michael had sent from Afghanistan, always ending with the same sentence: "If it wasn't for Tank, none of us would have made it home." Michael Williams, sergeant, died of cancer 2 years after the explosion. But before he died, he'd written with the admiration of youth about a man. Sergeant Morrison, quiet, stubborn, brave, the man who saved 6 soldiers' lives. Sarah looked back at the defendant. Head down, eyes lost, shoulders collapsed. Time had destroyed him, but it was him. The hero from her son's letters, handcuffed for disturbing the peace. Sarah swallowed hard, tried to keep her expression neutral, but the hand holding her pen trembled. The institutional coldness of the room seemed absurd in the face of this revelation. The hero from her son's stories, handcuffed for seeking shelter from a storm. The bailiff's voice cut through her thoughts. Docket number 1247, State versus Robert Morrison, disturbing the peace, trespassing. Robert sat motionless in the defendant's chair. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his weathered face. His hands, calloused and scarred, rested flat on the table. On his left forearm, barely visible through a tear in his sleeve, was an old scar. Jagged, deep. Sarah recognized that scar immediately from Michael's descriptions. Sergeant Morrison's scar runs from his wrist to his elbow. He got it pulling me out of that burning vehicle. He says it doesn't hurt anymore, but I see him rubbing it when he thinks no one's looking. The prosecutor droned on about vagrancy laws and repeat offenses. Robert didn't react. He sat like a man who'd already accepted whatever the world decided to impose on him. The sound of rain still echoed faintly through the building's windows, the same storm that had driven him to seek shelter. Sarah wrote something on a note, folded it carefully, and called a bailiff over. The instruction was clear. Take this to Attorney David Harrison personally. Tell him Judge Williams needs him here immediately. This is urgent. The bailiff left without question. In front of her, Robert lifted his eyes for just a brief second. The two looked at each other. She wanted to say something, but couldn't. Not here. Not yet. The prosecutor's voice grew sharper, more dismissive. Your Honor, we have a repeat offender here. Mr. Morrison has been cited multiple times for loitering, public intoxication, and now trespassing. Business owners are complaining about customers being disturbed. Robert flinched at the word customers. His fingers touched the torn sleeve unconsciously, tracing the scar beneath. The gesture was so small, so automatic, that only Sarah noticed. The defendant was found sleeping behind Jimmy's diner, the prosecutor continued, surrounded by empty bottles and disturbing paying customers trying to enjoy their meals. The lie hung in the air like smoke. There had been no bottles. The police report mentioned none, but Robert said nothing. He'd learned long ago that his word meant nothing against a badge and a pressed suit. A few people in the gallery whispered. Someone's phone buzzed. A woman in the back row looked at Robert with the kind of disgust reserved for things people step over on sidewalks. The fluorescent light above flickered, casting intermittent shadows that made everything feel unstable. The courtroom smelled like industrial disinfectant and old coffee. The air conditioning hummed too loud, drowning out the sound of Robert's quiet breathing. He sat perfectly still, military posture buried under years of defeat, but still there, still holding him upright. Furthermore, the prosecutor added with theatrical flair, vagrancy of this nature creates a public health hazard and diminishes property values in the surrounding area. Sarah watched Robert's face carefully. No anger, no defiance, just acceptance. The same quiet endurance that had once made him drag wounded soldiers through minefields was now keeping him silent while strangers decided his fate. The public defender finally arrived 30 minutes late, briefcase soaked from the rain. He glanced at the file for maybe 30 seconds before standing. Your Honor, my client pleads no contest. We request time served and community service, no contest, not even a fight. Robert looked down at his hands. The scar on his forearm caught the light again. Sarah remembered another line from Michael's letters. Sergeant Morrison never complains about anything. Not the heat, not the food, not getting shot at. He just does what needs doing and moves on. I wish I was half as strong. The prosecutor smiled, sensing victory. The state recommends 30 days county jail and a $1,000 fine, Your Honor. It's time to send a message that this behavior won't be tolerated. The gallery nodded approvingly. Easy math. One less homeless person on the streets. One less problem to step around. But then the courtroom doors opened with a bang that made everyone turn. David Harrison, attorney at law, announced a tall man in a dark suit. His voice cut through the room like a blade. I'm here to represent Mr. Morrison. The prosecutor barely hid his sneer. Last-minute representation, Your Honor. Highly irregular. Sarah's voice was steady as steel. I'll allow it. Proceed, Mr. Harrison. David Harrison wasn't just any lawyer. He was a name everyone in Chicago knew, a presence in high-profile cases that made headlines. He didn't usually appear in cases like this, but he was here for a reason only Sarah understood. Harrison flipped through the file quickly, asked clarifying questions, bought time. Within minutes, he was challenging the prosecution using basic principles of humanity and legality. There's no trespassing when there's no intent to steal or damage property, Your Honor. There's desperation, survival, and societal abandonment. The prosecutor fought back, talking about repeat behavior. Harrison countered, "What repeats here isn't crime, Your Honor. It's neglect. Systematic abandonment of those who served this country." The room fell silent. Meanwhile, Sarah kept her eyes fixed on Robert. He remained distant, as if he were somewhere else entirely. He didn't seem to recognize Harrison or understand what was happening. But Harrison was beginning to suspect something. This man wasn't just any homeless veteran. There was something in his posture. Even weakened, there was still discipline there. Still dignity buried under years of abandonment. During a brief recess, Harrison approached Sarah in the hallway. "Now tell me who he really is." Sarah hesitated, then spoke quietly. "The man who saved my son's life in Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Michael Williams. Tank Morrison pulled him out of a burning Humvee under enemy fire." Harrison stared at her for several seconds, then nodded. "Then we're not letting this slide as just another case." Back in the courtroom, Sarah made a decision that went against every protocol she knew. She stood up, stepped down from the bench, and walked toward Robert. The entire room went silent. Judges don't leave their seats during proceedings. She stopped 3 feet from him. Robert looked up, confused. Sarah reached into her robe pocket and pulled out something small, a set of dog tags, tarnished with age. She placed them gently on the table in front of him. "These belong to Staff Sergeant Michael Williams," she said quietly, so only Robert could hear. "He wanted you to have them." Robert stared at the tags. His hand trembled as he reached for them. When his fingers touched the metal, his breathing changed. The courtroom watched in absolute silence as this broken man held the tags against his chest. Sarah returned to her seat. No one spoke. No one moved. Robert closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. The silence stretched until Harrison stood and addressed the court with the gravity of a man about to rewrite history. "Your Honor, I request permission to present evidence regarding the true identity and service record of Robert James Morrison." He placed a thick folder on the table, documents that no one expected to see in that courtroom. Pentagon letterhead, classified mission reports, commendation records that had been buried in military bureaucracy for over a decade. Robert Morrison didn't just serve his country, Your Honor. He prevented the deaths of at least 6 American soldiers during an IED attack in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, in 2009. The prosecutor's confident expression began to crack. The gallery leaned forward. Harrison read from an official military report. Sergeant Morrison remained in position under heavy fire after ensuring the evacuation of 3 wounded soldiers. His voluntary decision to stay provided crucial time for squad reorganization and prevented additional casualties. The silence in the room was absolute. You couldn't hear papers rustling or shoes shuffling anymore. Furthermore, Harrison continued, Sergeant Morrison was recommended for the Medal of Honor, but the paperwork was lost in a bureaucratic transfer. He was medically discharged due to PTSD and traumatic brain injury, then forgotten by the system he served. Sarah's voice was firm, but her eyes were filled with tears. What we have here isn't just a case, ladies and gentlemen. It's a portrait of systemic failure. A man who served with honor, who saved lives, who was forgotten through administrative errors, and who now sits in this defendant's chair when he should be receiving honors. She gestured toward the back of the courtroom. 2 military officers entered. One carried a small blue box. Inside it, a Medal of Honor, an honor delayed by 15 years. Robert looked at it without understanding. It took him several seconds to process what he was seeing. When he realized what it was, his first reaction was to refuse. "No," he said quietly. "I didn't save them all." "Michael died because I failed," Sarah approached, not as a judge but as a mother. "He lived because of you. He came home. He wrote to me about you. He described you as the bravest man he'd ever known, and he asked me to find you if anything ever happened to him." Robert didn't respond. He just cried. And in that courtroom that had only seen him as a trespasser, everyone stood up. The prosecutor, the court clerk, the officers, the people in the gallery. No one said anything. No one needed to. Harrison's voice filled the silence. "The evidence shows that Robert Morrison single-handedly saved 6 lives, including that of Staff Sergeant Michael Williams, who lived for 3 additional years because of this man's courage. He dragged wounded soldiers through enemy fire, stayed behind to provide cover, and has carried this burden alone for 15 years. Sarah took a deep breath. "All charges are dismissed. The state will immediately begin processing all benefits and medical care owed to Sergeant Morrison under federal veterans legislation." The military officer stepped forward and pinned the Medal of Honor to Robert's torn jacket. Robert touched the medal with shaking fingers, then looked up at Sarah. "Thank you," he whispered, "for remembering. If you believe dignity always finds its voice, even in silence, subscribe now. It's how we remember what must never be forgotten." What should have been routine paperwork became a moment of historical reparation. The courtroom that had filled with laughter was now filled with tears of recognition. And Robert "Tank" Morrison walked out not as a defendant, but as the hero he'd always been. Some heroes don't wear their medals right away, but sometimes the medals find them anyway.